Join Revolution Radio every Wednesday, 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Studio B for Momentary Zen with host Zen Garcia at freedomslips.com, the People Station.
He wants a challenge. Let's give him one.
The voice that whispers in your ears are the screams that you fear. The mind you cannot defy is the heart that rules mankind. The people who made you are the gods that will save you. I am Steve Travesty. I am the voice. The ghost in the machine. Ghost in the Machine, Tuesdays, 8 p.m., Studio A.
Right here, Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, where information never sleeps. Revolution Radio. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Welcome back, everybody, to the second half of Talk Now Radio. This is your host, Royce Redneck Radio Man. And now we're going to move on to our next guest, Steve Sora, and we're going to be discussing his book, Secret Societies of America's Elite. So, Steve, I do have you here with me, right?
Yeah, glad to be here.
Okay. I wasn't sure if you'd stay on the line there when you heard the music and realized it was me or not. I think it was just some, prank caller, in other words. So I'm glad to hear you with me, and we can get this here show moving on the road. What I usually like to do, Steve, is to have everybody, kind of tell them a little something about themselves, kind of like what got you interested in writing about this particular material, because I know you've also written other books about similar material, but not quite the same, correct?
Yep.
Okay, so what got you interested in writing about the secret societies of America's elite?
Little bit of a long story, but my main interest had always been Atlantic crossings before Columbus. And in researching that, I researched a trip that Henry Sinclair made in 1398 to Nova Scotia, and I kind of felt that the information given was pretty factual, but it never really dawned on me how important it was. He was a family that came from Vikings, and so they had made the voyages before, so it was no big deal. And then in the 80s, I read Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which was about how Henry Sinclair and the Sinclair family were very prominent in the Knights Templar and later in the hereditary guardians of Freemasonry. And so that got me more interested in the whole story and the Templar treasure that might have been brought to Americas. When my book came out, a guy with the last name of Temple, who wrote some weird esoteric subjects, was telling me how his family was derived from Knights Templar and how much property that the Templars and through them the Freemasons owned in colonial America. And at first I couldn't believe it, and everything he had told me kind of worked out. So I started researching just what happened at the demise of the Templars in 1307, and then kind of followed that through the present time with the different secret societies that they spawned.
Okay. Well, listen, before we get too far in depth, and I forget to do this here, I want to let everybody know real quick that if you want to learn more about Steve and his material, you can go to www.goodreads.com/Arthur/show 37782.Steve_Sora, which is a bit of a long URL. You can also just Google Intertraditions. They have a search engine on their website, and you could type Steve Sora into Intertraditions search engine, and they will take you to every book that they have on him, as well as his biography and his picture. And pardon that little burst in my voice there, it got away from me. But in other words, where you can learn a little bit more about him and about his material, about what kind of other books he's written, etc. And Steve, have you thought about getting your own website by any chance?
I'm not sure if it's up or not right now. I've just started working with GoDaddy, and it would be TemplarTreasure.com.
TemplarTreasure.com. I'll check into that probably after the show. But, you know, you said something just a minute ago that caught my attention. I've done a lot of study on the Knights Templars, ancient religion, ancient mythology, and all of that. Like I've said here on this show several times since I've been a host here. It's a favorite topic of mine. Do a lot of study in it. And I once read a similar article to the one you're telling me about. And as I was given to understand it, because I was researching my family tree at the time, that on their way to Nova Scotia to found it, the Sinclair family actually stopped off in America, and some of them stayed and procreated with the Indians, which is where you get a lot of, American families today that are, part English and part Indian, in other words.
I just got back from Newport, where I was at part of the NERA conference, New England Antiquities Research, and my theory is that when Sinclair came to Nova Scotia, he was instrumental in later having built the Money Pit, which is a mystery that's lasted till today.
Is that at Oak Island?
That's right. But the two people that he had sailed with decided they wanted to go further, and he went down to Newport, and there's a lot of different things along the way that he left behind, including a grave of a knight that had come with him, and it's carved into a rock in a town called Westford, and it's in so much detail that a Scottish heraldist was able to identify the person who was killed there and who they made the kind of effigy in stone for. And then all the way to the Newport Tower. The Newport Tower was constructed just like a Cistercian baptistry, 8 sides, and it actually has some abilities to predict the solstice, to predict when the moon cycle meets the sun cycle, which happens every 19 years, and just pretty amazing. Later, people said that was built by colonists or whatever. Benedict Arnold's grandfather said that he owned it, but he never said that he built it. And in 1524, Verrazano sailed over here looking for it. He spent no time from Chesapeake through New York City, or the future New York City, where he sailed, through the Verrazano Narrows and all that, and then he went to Newport, where he stayed there for 2 weeks. And Samuel Eliot Morrison actually described the journey and said that he had a pilot, an American Indian pilot, that came aboard the ship to guide it through the through the harbor of Newport. So I believe what happened was that the Sinclair family left the tower there. Their colony was a certain amount of people that they left behind, and Verrazano knew what he was looking for. The only problem is kind of like what you said. When he got there was no colony anymore. They had probably been so cut off from the old world that they did intermarry with Native Americans. He described the people that lived there as, his words, leaning towards whiteness, and they actually had a queen whose name was Magnus, which is kind of like a Viking name or an Orkney name, which Sinclairs were the rulers of the Orkney Islands. So I think you're right. I think there was a colony there. I think the people intermarried, and that there's evidence of that that remains.
Well, you hit on something a minute ago that I was going to come to next, and I was going to go into a little bit further, is why I was saving it for after the stopover of the Mr. Sinclair there, and that was the Oak Island mystery, because I knew about that. I've actually had a guy on my show about it many, many years ago, and I had almost forgot about him. But you know what? I have actually theorized that an excellent hiding place to put the Ark of the Covenant would be right there in that Oak Island little treasure repository, because as I understand it, it's got all kinds of traps keeping you from getting to it.
Right, that was the amazing thing. They had discovered it way back in 1795, that they dug 3 feet down, and there were flagstones, which are not indigenous to Oak Island. Then every 10 feet there was an oaken platform. Finally, they got down to 90 feet. When they removed the platform, the shaft started getting flooded, and that shaft still exists today. What they found out and over the years that they've been trying to beat this water trap was that there were tunnels that came from both sides of the island, and there were actually drains that were covered in eelgrass, again, not indigenous to the island, which would keep them from getting clogged. And so you reach a certain level, and bam, the flood comes in, and you're unable to go any further. And that's been plaguing the thing since 1795. There's just a thing on the History Channel, Curse of Oak Island. They're still having the same problems today. They can't get any further down the shaft, and a handful of people have died trying, either through gas or a boiler exploding that was trying to pull out all the water fast. So that is an amazing treasure place and an amazing booby trap to stop people from getting there.
Yeah, and just think, if the Ark of the Covenant was actually buried there by the Sinclair family, it should be sitting there rusting into dust, as long as it's been underwater now.
Well, I think what may have happened was that they have shafts that go higher than 90 feet, and they probably start down there somewhere, and then they go inwards, and then there's different rooms and vaults. They actually had a drill go through a cement vault, and they brought up like a little piece of chain, a little piece of gold parchment, and nothing else really. And then they sent a camera down, and something like 200 feet, they saw a human hand. So, but I think that the actual vaults where the treasure would be to the sides of the original shaft. And this is what they did in Madagascar. There was an island called St. Mary's. Well, the island's still there, but at one time it was the first democracy in the world, and it was all different pirates that would go down there, and they'd fix their boats and everything, and they'd have these different things that each one could go down to their own vault, and it was similar to that. And supposedly there was another one on Haiti, although I don't think anyone ever came up with actually how that one worked. But it could save a treasure, or, somewhere along the line someone might have moved the treasure thinking that, it's quite busy with all the people that came to Nova Scotia eventually. One thing that's interesting is the Sinclair family built a chapel in Scotland called the Roslin Chapel, and the word is like from the Rose Line, which is also in St. Sulpice, another mysterious place in Paris, and the town most close to Oak Island, where there's some remains of like a castle, is a place called New Ross. And so some people have believed that, the Sinclair family actually built a little mini castle. It's very small, and that was used to house the people that were working, digging this booby trap that became the money pit.
That's kind of interesting. I had a guy on my show here about 3-4 years back, Renee Barrett, I think was his name. He was the filmmaker for Bloodline, the movie, and he knew the guy that had actually went and found a cave not far from Roslin Chapel that they had run a camera into an opening in this cave, and found out that there was a room in there that had all kinds of rolls of what they thought was maybe scrolls of scriptures, a big casket, books, all kinds of stuff like that. There would probably be a fascinating historical find if they ever find a way to get into the place.
Supposedly there was even a cave that could hold like 1,000 men, and I went there, and it just seemed to rain all the time, so I kind of gave up walking along the river Esk and through some of the hills there. But it's definitely a mysterious place.
Yeah, very much. And, it also goes to show, though, that the Sinclairs have a history of burying stuff into hard-to-get-to places that it doesn't want found, or it doesn't want found for at least several generations.
Well, I believe what happened is 1307, October 13th, the French king wants to arrest all the Templars, and his army reaches the treasury of the Templars in Paris. What happened 3 days before was they had put all that treasure on a wagon train that went across land to Rochelle, and from La Rochelle it was taken to different places. I believe Scotland, and the islands around Scotland are amazing. You can hide a battleship fleet like the Germans actually did in World War I. and that's how they hid it. And a couple of years later, they joined up with the Scottish independence movement, which was Robert the Bruce. Robert the Bruce had declared himself king, killed his rival on the altar of a church, and so the Pope excommunicated him, making him an outlaw. Around the same time, it was when the Pope excommunicated the order, and the Knights Templar became outlaws. So it was almost a natural for the order to, take refuge in a place where there was an outlaw king. So at the Battle of Bannockburn, we always see in the movies the Scots get attacked by the English, and the Scots are coming with cannons and rifles and everything else. I mean, the English are, and the Scots are answering them with spears and rocks. And it looked like a typical battle in the beginning, that the Scots were being beat back. And then all of a sudden, a force of knights rode out from the woods and routed the British. And this was on June 24th, which is St. John the Baptist feast day, which is the most sacred day to the Knights Templar.
Okay. Now, the big question here for this one. Of this material we've been talking about, is there quite a bit of it in your book, the one that we're here to talk about today, by any chance?
Most of the information that we discussed so far is in the first book that I wrote, which is called Lost Treasure of the Knights Templar. The Verrazano is in kind of a follow-up book called The Lost Templar Colony. The Secret Societies book covers basically the fact that the Templars weren't really beat. There was something like 6,000 Templar Knights. About 1,000 were arrested. And so that leaves 5,000, and each knight had his own retinue of maybe a dozen people that took care of the horses and mounted the armor and everything like that. And so there's quite a few Templars that survived. And basically that's what my book covers, like where they went. The Templars had the biggest fleet in the world, and so they went into piracy. And the skull and the crossbones is well known as a pirate symbol. And they had been the biggest bank in the world. And this was an important part of my Secret Societies book, that they went to Switzerland. And when Acre fell in 1291, they knew the writing was on the wall. It was the last Templar fortress in the Middle East, and so they basically, their reason to be was kind of negated by that loss. So in 1291, a bunch of Templars went to Switzerland, and they had 3 of the cantons in Switzerland joined together, and within a couple of months of 1291, and almost the same thing happened. There was a famous battle in Switzerland where the Swiss were fighting the Habsburgs, and obviously the Habsburg was the Holy Roman Empire, so it was so much greater than these little cantons in Switzerland, and all of a sudden a huge force came out of nowhere and routed the Habsburgs. And so again, the Templars were back in battle, and 2 of the greatest mercenary forces in the world were the Scots Guard, which are from where the Templars ended up in Scotland, and the second most and possibly better known is the Swiss Guard, which ironically protects the Vatican today. Both of those, I think, were outgrowths from the Templar order.
Wait a minute. You just got one on me that time. I have heard a lot of things. That's the first time I heard about the Swiss Guard. But, conceptually here, what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the Knights Templar began as the Jerusalem's protector, and they ended up in England protecting for the papacy through some kind of transfer, if I understand it correctly. And then at some point, the aristocracy, on October 13th, I forget the year now, you just said it a minute ago.
1307.
1307, October 30th, I think it was the 31st, or... No, it might have been 13th.
No, it was actually Friday the 13th.
That's what I'm thinking.
Some people believe that made Friday the 13th the unlucky day. I'm not sure that that's true, but it is a coincidence at least.
Right, I heard that before, too. I read it online. But it does sound like a strange coincidence. But at any rate, at this point, they had to go underground. They come over to America and to Canada. And then before everything's all said and done, they go back over to Europe and start protecting the Romans again after what happened back in the 1300s?
Well, the odd thing is that the Sinclair family at the time that the Templars were broken up, and even much later, they were still ardent Catholics. Even though the Pope had turned on them, they still kept their faith. And I guess they added a lot of esoteric things to their faith, including like the chapel at Roslyn is kind of where one, Templarism meets Freemasonry, and two, where Celtic symbols meet, Celtic pagan symbols meet Christianity. So I think they just were put in an awkward position that that's what happened. And the Vatican supposedly later took the ban of excommunication off the order, and so it was much later that the actual Swiss Guard, which would have employed former, or say, ancestors of the Templars, now the Swiss Guard guarded the Pope. It's really interesting in Switzerland how today, and this is hundreds of years later, if you want to be a banker in Switzerland and work in a city like Basel, you have to be a Freemason. There's no way around it. And the secrecy of the Swiss is kind of like the secrecy of the Templars once upon a time. A lot of the flags of the different cantons that make up Switzerland are virtually Templar flags that had existed before. And my Secret Society book also covers that they went to Portugal, too, where the knights were actually just able to undergo a name change. And one of the biggest orders became the Knights of Christ. And Christopher Columbus married a woman whose father was in the Knights of Christ. He was actually an Italian that went to sea for the Portuguese. And so he was like an ex-Templar, basically. And that's why Christopher Columbus's flags fly the Templar cross.
Okay. Now, do you think there's any possibility that there might be other motives for the Knights Templar to want to stay so close to the Vatican even after what happened? Like maybe perhaps there's information they think the Vatican may have they hope to get, or any other agendas?
I think it's very possible, and I think that there's been an effort over the last 20 years by some to get rid of the Freemasons that are in the Vatican. And it's really strange because you're not allowed to be a Freemason and be a part of the Catholic faith. We had in the state of Pennsylvania, the Attorney General decided to become a Freemason. He went to church and the priest denied him communion. He had never understood that before or knew about it, and that was one of the consequences. So the church on the outside is still anti-Freemason, but at the same time, there may be a lot of Freemasons that are kind of underground within the church.
Well, it's been my understanding that there's a lot of crypto. Pardon me, I'm sorry about that. A lot of crypto Jews that's working behind the scenes in the Vatican. Now, that's what you read about, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the person who wrote it is correct.
Well, the odd thing about Italy is that they accepted all the Jews for a certain amount of years, and so when Isabella and Ferdinand decided to kick out all the Jews the same year that Columbus sailed, basically most of them went to like Sicily and the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean, and then into Italy. And a lot of Italian-sounding last names were actually Jewish names that they just changed, and they remain crypto-Jews. Some of them still have certain customs, but it may have been like tens of thousands of people that are in Italy and have that heritage.
No, that wouldn't surprise me any at all. But one of the questions I was going to get around to asking you is, what kind of influence did the Knights Templar have in the founding of America and the, should we say formation might be a good word?
I believe that they had a lot of influence, and like there were so many signers of the Declaration that had been Freemasons. John Hancock is a great example. He was in two lodges, and one was a lodge for people that were wealthy and owned ships and all that. And at the same time, he was in another lodge that called St. Andrews that met at the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston. And this was the lodge where all the working men were, the guy that was shipwrights and rope makers and things like that. And so basically, if you wanted to work for John Hancock, and supposedly he employed about a quarter of the city at one time, you had to be on the level, and that expression means we can trust you, that you're a Mason. And until like a John Hancock ship would come into port, and the taxman would come on board and want to see what they're offloading, and the people that worked on the ship would lock them up and unload the ship and then let them out. And so he was instrumental, both from a point of his own commerce getting done, but from another point of, wanting liberty. Benjamin Franklin obviously was a Freemason, and he went to Europe to enlist the French to the cause. He was in an order called, and this is a Masonic order called the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, and he actually inducted Voltaire into that order. And from there, he kind of collected different people that would come over, including the Marquis Lafayette, and also helped get other people to come over that were military people in what once upon a time was the Templar rival order, the Knights of Malta. So from a military standpoint and a philosophical standpoint, the Masons did had a lot of influence in the forming of America.
Well, one of the things you mentioned a minute ago, if you don't mind, I'd like to kind of go back to, because I was just thinking about it, was the fact that the Jolly Roger was their, the Jolly Roger, the skull and crossbones was their symbol, which actually flew on top of the Jolly Roger ship a whole lot. You mentioned there being pirates back in those days, but did you ever stop and think that maybe perhaps rather than a all-out confrontation with the powers that be of their day, they thought they could do more damage or more good, however you want to look at it, by preemptive strikes as pirates?
One thing that was interesting was that people that traded in those days, whether it was a small fleet or the Knights of Malta or the Knights Templar, a lot of times if they couldn't get what they wanted in trade, they got it by piracy. And the rules were very vague. They always could find someone that they would sail for, including pirates later on when the colonies were here. And so they only went to piracy full time then after the order was broken up. Then they really didn't have any choice. Their ships weren't welcome in ports outside of La Rochelle, which remained a Templar port much later. But a lot of other ports wouldn't let their ships in, so they resorted to piracy. And the symbol itself, supposedly the Templars believe that all it takes really for a consecrated burial is the crossbones, two bones either from the legs or the arms, and the skull. And when you go into Scotland, a lot of the graves that are Templar graves have that, and if it's someone very important, they have a full effigy of the knight with the legs crossed. But most of the graves that are in regular churchyards just have the skull and crossbones. The name Freemason is a name for a brotherhood rather than just a made-up word. It's not just for people that are Masons. And Jolie Rouge was another word that was kind of derived from the French. It meant the beautiful red, and that was their. That's why that was their flag.
Okay. Now, do you think there's any connection between the skull and bones of today and the Knights Templar?
The skull and bones that is at Yale, I think there is a big connection. Only it kind of went through possibly German orders like the Teutonic Knights, and these were they were like Templars. They were fighting alongside the Templars in the Holy Land, and when the Pope ordered all these orders shut down and everything, they marched into court in Prussia and basically said, try to arrest us. And so they were just given the freedom to do whatever they wanted from there. So the relationship always kind of stayed the same. From the German orders that were kind of like ex-Templar orders, the Americans hooked up with those orders, I think, around 1850, and that's when they brought basically the book about how Skull and Bones in Yale would operate. And it was a guy named Russell who was actually part of the China trade, and these were ships that were going over to China. We had nothing to trade, so basically they'd stop in India, buy opium, sell it to the Chinese whether they wanted it or not, and they went to war twice two opium wars for England. And when the English stopped the opium trade, the American companies kind of took it over, and some very big names and some names that are connected to Freemasonry. And so this person, Russell, basically founded Skull and Bones at Yale. And it's really interesting because that's where my book kind of leads to, that today it's just amazing that a few years ago we had Kerry running against Bush. Now, in the Skull and Bones order, they only pick 15 people a year. They say they tap them into the order. And so what would be the odds of both party candidates running against each other for the president, and both of those men having been in Skull and Bones at Yale? It's kind of infinitesimal. So it shows that they still have pretty amazing powers over this country.
They have more than that in common from what I've read. I've actually read they're both Jewish.
That I don't know. I think it's interesting that John Kerry, wherever he came from, I think it was one of the opium families, because there was a Kerry Forbes that was part of the drug running. He married into the family of Hines. Senator Hines got killed supposedly because he knew too much about the October surprise when Reagan was president. And so Hines' widow had $700 million, and Kerry out of nowhere married her. So, but I believe she's a Catholic. Her original heritage is Portuguese, and that she's a Catholic.
Okay. Now, I haven't read your book, so I'm not sure what all it covers. Maybe you'd like to take a second to kind of fill us in a little bit on things that I might be missing that's in the book, kind of, whet people's appetite for it.
Well, the first thing was, if the book's 4 sections, the first is the story of the Knights breaking up and the different things, different businesses that they went into. They had been basically international bankers. They started what's now called branch banking. Like if you lived in England, you wanted to go to Jerusalem to visit the Holy Land, you could deposit your money in the Templar Bank in England and make the dangerous voyage all the way to Jerusalem and then withdraw your funds. So if along the way you were robbed, you were still covered. Your money was still there. And so they went, they were the first to do this. They were the most powerful institution in the world. Then all of a sudden they lost their businesses, so they went into different things. One part of the book is piracy, and it shows how this piracy existed up until 1700 in the United States. The second part is in the slave trade. The Templars had actually been in the slave trade, and they just went into it in the United States colonies as well. The two places where it was the most important was in Rhode Island and in South Carolina. 2 lodges basically controlled it, and believe it or not, the whole Rhode Island Templar Freemason Lodge was Jewish, and they were running the slave trade between them and the South. The third part is the drug trade, and there's numerous people that their names grace libraries and universities today that basically made their fortunes in the drug trade. And again, in Rhode Island, Brown University was a person that I think he was also Jewish, and he made his money completely in the opium trade. In Connecticut, I think the person named Yale was the one. Yale has kind of a anti-university website, and they publish all the different names of the people that were early trustees of Yale and how they were involved in opium. And then the last part of not the last part yet, a big part was on the Revolutionary War and the different influences they had. And the last part then was bringing it up to modern times.
So basically, a lot of America's early income during its founding period came from tobacco, hemp, and opium.
That's true, and in a lot of cases, it may have been forced on the Americans that they weren't be able to be involved on a lot of things without being seriously taxed. But it's true that the real money was in things that as soon as they make something illegal, it's more profitable.
Yeah, it kind of makes you wonder if they didn't make it illegal just to make it profitable.
Right. It was actually a law in this country that if you were a farmer, you had to grow hemp. Hemp was considered something that was a strategic thing, I guess, for use in shipping and everything. So it's funny how it did a complete turnaround. I don't think they were smoking it then, though.
Yeah, but you know what happens when they make it illegal? Not only does it increase in value through people buying it more because it now becomes forbidden fruit, but you can also now charge more for it because people are willing to pay more to get it because it's harder to get. And on top of that, you can find people who buy the stuff.
I think the worst thing is that, and as a result of the price going up and it being illegal, that you have so much violence brought in gangs and things like that. I don't think we ever had that before Prohibition, that people would be, shooting each other over the liquor trade.
So basically, by making the stuff illegal, they also tapped people's, say, hidden anger. People become more desperate for it, probably because of addiction. What do you think?
On one side, right, the addiction that, it would be something that people get involved with maybe in a level that they wouldn't have got into before. Like people in Peru chew cocoa because they live in the Andes and they need to kind of pick themselves up from having low oxygen. They don't become addicts over it, though. And in the United States, they refined cocoa into cocaine, and people easily become addicted to that.
Yeah, people easily become addicted to a lot of things. And then, it seems like more and more the things people become addicted to end up getting legal against the law, or delegalized, you might say, shortly after everybody's hooked on it really good. And that's when some kind of law will make it necessary to delegalize it. You know what I'm saying?
Right. It's the history of drugs in this country is really interesting. The Sears catalog actually carried heroin, and at that time it was considered something for the housewife who worked around the house that needed something to relax her.
Okay. Now, also, I don't want to have you get out of here without finding out. Do you have any other books that you're coming up with in the near future?
Well, I'm working on a book about Sir Francis Bacon and the Rosicrucians and the influence that they had on this country. And it's just, it's been slow going, but it's been unraveling kind of fast lately. There's a place in Virginia, in Williamsburg, that is called the Bruton Vault, and it's also been called the Bacon Vault. And a lot of these secret writings of Sir Francis Bacon and whatever, and possibly other treasures, were buried in this vault under a churchyard. And the place is really interesting itself as it lines up with other different places in Virginia, like Thomas Jefferson's home and all that. I'm not big on ley lines, but it's just kind of interesting that this exists there. And there's other, in Pennsylvania we have a place called Ephrata, and a whole bunch of Rosicrucians under a guy named Kelpius came over. They landed in Philadelphia. I think it was called the Tavern of the Dove, which is a Rosicrucian symbol. They lived in caves in Philadelphia, which I had a hard time finding, but I did find them. And there's actually Rosicrucian monuments there. And then they moved out to Ephrata, which is out in kind of the middle of the state near where the Battle of Gettysburg was fought. And from there, people like Benjamin Franklin would come to see them, Thomas Jefferson would. They actually helped print up a lot of the documents that would be pamphlets for, fighting against England. But they lived like monks, and they had some weird characteristics that the women wouldn't be able to live by the men. They actually had a building that was kind of like the tower at Newport, although I don't think it was astronomically lined up. But they had a strong influence there. And all the way out to California, there's Rosicrucians in different areas that you kind of wouldn't expect.
Okay. That's a rather in-depth subject in itself. I one time ran across the book called, I think it was The New Atlantis by Sir Francis Bacon. And in this here book that I read, it covered a new land that him and his crew was wanting to found. And he was telling the king of the property where they had broken down at or shipwrecked at temporarily about the kind of things that they expected to have. And it sounded an awful lot like the kind of things we have here in America today. I don't know if you ran across that book or not.
A lot of people believe that the Bacon's New Atlantis was America. And there was a guy named Dr. John Dee who influenced Bacon when Bacon was younger. And he talked to him about the Welsh that had come over here to America, Prince Madoc, and also that Avalon, the kingdom of King Arthur, ended up coming to America. And in Newfoundland, Bacon had got a lot of territory for himself, and there is the Avalon Peninsula. And in 1910, there was a stamp to Sir Francis Bacon defining his role as being behind the colonization scheme, which I guess they mean scheme is a good word in those days. And so he definitely had an influence there. I think it was his brother-in-law was a guy named Gosnold. Gosnold landed in Martha's Vineyard in Cape Cod. He named Martha's Vineyard after his daughter. Then he went to Jamestown, where he was the first head of the colony, although we're never taught that in school. John Smith gets all the credit for Jamestown. And then they also, Sir Francis Raleigh, that was a rival at times and also close to Bacon, he had sent a ship over that accidentally landed in Bermuda. And I went to Bermuda to see what kind of Masonic influences might be there. Their customs house looks like a Masonic temple, and skull and crossbones and coffins with X's on them and things like that. So that's part of what I'm putting together for my next book.
That's pretty interesting to me, Steve, because the crossbones are in the shape of an X. You're talking about the X's in a lot of places where Freemasons have been, and then you got X in front of Christmas. You can't wonder there's some kind of a Christ connection or symbolically saying we are Christ through this X being left in different forms everywhere they go, maybe?
I have a feeling that that's true, and in a lot of cases it also means a directional symbol that, X marks the spot, but also connecting one place to another. And I recently met Scott Walter, who's doing the Unearthing America series on TV, and his book is The Hooked X, and showing that there is some secret meaning behind the whole thing.
I'd like to study up on that X and Freemasonry. Google it that way. Maybe I'd be surprised what I come up with. But in the meantime, about some of your other books, would you like to take a moment to kind of bring the listeners up to speed about what the other things you wrote about?
The two other things are kind of different topics. One is a book called Treasures from Heaven, which wasn't really my pick of the title, but basically it's about mostly Christian relics and the meaning that we put into them. And some are as little as the bones of saints. Every Catholic church has to have the bones of two saints. And I had never heard about this before until I started researching it. And they usually keep them behind the altar. And why they do that is because they inspire miracles. Like the person, Father Juniper Serra, was the person that started the missions in California and going into Mexico. And so there's a big move to make him a saint. And a lot of people are on the other side, like Latino people think, okay, they were colonizing us, so maybe it wasn't a good thing. But nuns actually grind up his bones into little pieces, and they don't sell the bones because they're not allowed to do that, but they put them in what's called a reliquary, and they sell the reliquary. And so if you just got one today and said you were praying for your mom and she got cured of her cancer, and somebody else says the same thing, well, you got your two miracles, and that's okay to fast-track Father Juniper Serra into being a saint. And in the medieval times, these things took on a gigantic role. Like whoever had the best relics would have the most tourism in their cathedral. So someone that had a piece of the True Cross or a bone of Mary Magdalene, or when I was doing this, I sent my son over to Italy, and he got a picture of St. Thomas's finger. Supposedly, a lot of these are fake. But in fact, there's so many that were fake because of that. That someone once said, if there were only 12 apostles, how come we have 39 burials of apostles in Germany? And the true cross, there's so many pieces of the true cross that they could build Noah's Ark again. And it wasn't just that. It was like there's in Naples, and I went to this site also. San Gennaro is the patron saint of the city, and every year, even in modern times, they take out his blood twice a year. That's in vials, and the vials go from liquid to solid during his ceremony, and then back to liquid again. And there is a scientific explanation for that, but if they don't make the change, it's considered very unlucky. And the last time they didn't make the change, Naples had an earthquake. So people believe in these things, and it's become such a big thing in the United States now that people have these icons, whether we believe in, memorabilia for a movie star or something. People just put a lot of faith into such lucky symbols, and I think that's why it existed that way through the history of Christianity.
It sounds to me like a lot of these here fake bones and crosses and stuff they're coming up with, the only real power they probably have is psychological in the minds of the superstitious.
I believe that's true also. I think we all have our lucky shirt or something that we feel that there's a better outcome to what's going to happen today if I feel I'm going to be lucky today. So it could be a rabbit's foot or whatever.
Or could it be that anything can actually have power to be lucky if all it's really doing is activating your own faith in yourself, and you just recognize it as faith in an outside object?
That's true, and there's also there's people that are kind of historically known within Christianity that they have certain powers. Like when I was a kid, my mother said she'd always pray to St. Jude for me, and I later found out he was the patron saint of lost causes. But a funny story, that a mob figure, and I can't think of his name offhand, he was arrested in New York with about 15 other people. Then a witness that was going to testify against him was killed, and so he was charged with ordering that hit. And the people that were prosecuting him, one was the future mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, and the other was the future head of the FBI, Louis Freeh. So he took all the people that were charged with him. They took a bus and went down to Baltimore, where the American Shrine of St. Jude is, and they went there to pray, and all the charges were later dropped. So I don't always believe in all that, but like you said, sometimes believing in it makes the power in itself.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people that have a lot of trouble getting confidence in themselves, they have more confidence, the ability to get more confidence in something other than themselves. And it just kind of like works like, say, I don't know, a Ouija board, you might say. But I think in the end, most your magic comes from your own faith and your own belief.
Right, I agree with you. There's an expression, there's no atheists in the foxholes, and, that's time to find God if I found him before.
Well, we're getting pretty close to the shutdown time. We still got about 6 minutes. Is there anything that you'd like to talk about that I haven't thought to ask you about?
Well, I have one other book, and that was about the Battle of Troy. Originally, Homer wrote this tale, and Troy was supposed to be in Turkey, and Homer actually wrote it on the island of Chios, which was really it was part of Greece, but it was right offshore Turkey. And so we come to learn that the Trojan War was fought there. I wrote a book, Triumph of the Sea Gods, talking about where I really believe the war was fought. And this had come out of two other people that wrote books also saying that it was in the Atlantic, but not where I said it was. And then this woman that contacted me from my first book and said that there's a legend of King Priam of Troy. He actually was from France, and that there's the city of Troy, Troyes, in France, and the name Priam turned into Prime. A lot of the ancient Greek historians didn't want to say it because of Alexander the Great, but they believed also that the whole description of the Odyssey was in the Atlantic Ocean. So I went to Portugal, and there's Lisbon, which was the city of Hercules. And then there's Setubal, which is the city of the Lord. And then there's the third city, Troy, Troia. And Troy was actually hit by an earthquake and a tsunami. And today on the beaches of Troy, because it's just all flat, whereas Lisbon and Setubal are higher up on the plateau, there's actually statues coming out of the sands on the beaches. And so I think the Phoenicians that brought the story from the Atlantic, they carried it to the Greeks, and they carried the alphabet. And so it was originally a story that was situated somewhere else. There's so many flaws in Homer's work as far as he describes how they fought with chariots, which wasn't done in the time period that he says it was, vegetation that didn't exist, and Troy, which is actually inland. He talks about the crashing waves. The crashing waves are more reminiscent of the Atlantic. He also talks about the weather as cold and dark, which again, more out in the Atlantic than in Turkey, which is on the Mediterranean Sea. So it's an interesting theory. There's two other people. One wrote that it was actually happened in England, and another one wrote that the war happened in the Netherlands. But it is an interesting concept how the story just got molded by Homer and to reflect a completely different time period in a different place.
Well, then too, you got to ask yourself, when and where did he get his copy of the story, and did he just take it at face value? Because, I mean, back then, how would he have researched it with no internet at his fingertips?
Right. I believe it was kind of a tale that was told along the Atlantic that survived. The actual Trojan War coincided with a gigantic earthquake that happened in Portugal in around 1200 BC, and so the story was legend there 300-400 years later. And when the Phoenicians brought the alphabet, they brought the story. Homer just decided that he had to put it in the context of something that the Greek people would find interesting, and so that's why there were so many changes for it. Like he talks about in Homer, it's like women like Circe and Calypso that were basically just considered sirens at the time, or priestesses, whereas in mythology that extended all along the Atlantic, these were goddesses. Like the goddess Kali is known from India to Ireland, and she was the calendar goddess, and the Book of Kells originated from writings that were from long ago. And Calypso, it's just another variation on the name. Circe, which is the one that turned the men into pigs, she was also a very important goddess. She was like the grain goddess that was also worshipped all over the world. So, but in Greek times, we went to a more masculine god and kind of like pushed out the female part of everything, and so that's why a lot of that story had to change.
Okay, then. Well, I show we got 1 minute left, so I know that we can't talk too much further without getting their music interrupting us here, telling us, get off the air, you. But before we escape, shall I say, don't forget to come visit me at www.talknowradio.net. Membership is free. It gets you into the chat room, and I do have a newsletter for those of you that want to be kept up to date. It goes out once or twice a week as I have the shows. This Saturday at 1 p.m. live at talknowradio.net, it's going to be Ross Heaven talking about the shamanic quest for the spirit of Salvia. Would love to have people there. Would love to see you in the chat room and talking about it and visiting just like you do over here. Don't be bashful. Come on over. Is there anything last minute you'd like to throw out there, Steve?
No, I think we pretty much covered a lot of my work, so just want to thank you for inviting me aboard.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for coming, and I want you to know there's always an open door for you to, return to my show, and I'd be more than happy to have you over at my show on my site. This here's a big network at Revolution Radio that I do a show for every Thursday from 1 to 3, or no, 1. I'm getting the times mixed up. But it's a 2-hour slot I do from, I think it's 2 to 4 Eastern time, whatever that converts to Central, which I should know it in my time. I think it's 1 to 3 my time. My mind's going in a circle on the times right now. But Want to thank you guys for listening in. Couldn't have a show without you. Want to thank you for coming, Steve. We got your information. I'd like to stay in touch if that's okay with you.
That sounds good.
All righty. Y'all have a good one.
And thank you. Bye-bye.
Listening to Revolution Radio.
This is the people's war. It is our war. We are the fighters. Fight it then. Fight it with all that is in us. And may God defend the right.
Warning! Warning!
We gotta stop them! They're gonna kill us all! See how the trouble you've started? Be they the government, be they industry, be they organized labor, be they anyone, or human beings. Time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener supported